Good afternoon, guys. So to begin with a question. What do you personally know about mass communication in general? You're probably thinking about either your mobile phone, email, the internet, or something different. Now try to answer the same question, but imagine you live in the 18th century. To be able to answer that question, I will inform you guys later about the 18th as well as the 17th century to compare with.
But first, what is mass communication? Mass communication is when a group, a person, or people send a message through a channel of communication to a large group of people. This sounds pretty complicated, but what these channels of communication are radios, TVs, and of the more modern forms, social media. Just a way for a person to send a message to a large crowd. But in the 18th century, we didn't quite have radio and televisions, since the radio wouldn't be invented until the late 19th century and the television wasn't invented until 1927. Social media wouldn't even come near the 18th century, as we all know. So it didn't leave many forms of mass communication. Like the newspaper and the mail, the newspaper didn't change a lot over the period of the 18th century. Before the beginning of the 18th century, newspapers were often heavily censored. But then the British government changed the censor laws. This gave opportunity for journalists to write more controversial articles. People were able to criticize things without being censored. That meant that people could voice their opinion over a large audience. The newspaper also started to get more news about foreign countries. This was largely contributed by the fact that there were better communication lines between countries. The Times, one of the most well-known newspapers today, also originated in the 18th century. But that wasn't the only thing that changed about newspapers. It also gained some sub-bodies, like the tabloid. The tabloid was invented in 1712. The British Empire started to tax amount of pages in a newspaper. The tabloid was a large sheet of paper, roughly the size of an A3. The tabloids mainly focused on gossip. Another sub-body of the newspaper were magazines. Magazines in the 18th century were often related to fashion. In these fashion magazines, you would find the newest fashion trends and look at the drawn pictures of women and men wearing these newest fashion trends. But the newspaper wasn't the only thing that changed. The mail also changed, and my friends will tell you a little bit more about that.
The mail in the 18th century was an important thing. However, around the world there were no real efficient post services. None even in some countries. I'm going to tell you guys something about the post services in England and the United States. In 1782, John Palmer, an owner of a theatre in Bath, was frustrated about the fact that letters to and from London took way too long to arrive. It usually took about 3 days to reach the other city. The solution he came up with were mail coaches. John Palmer proposed the idea of a more ambitious scheme. The mail had to be carried by special coaches, with strong and good horses, armed by guards and no outside passengers. There was a strong opposition from the post office of that time, but the Chancellor of Exchequer gave Palmer his support. After a few contracts, the mail coach was reality, under the name of Royal Mail. The first mail coach ran from Bristol to London in 1784. The coach was a great success, and the services were launched in more cities, such as Liverpool, Manchester, Norwich, Swansea, etc. In the United States, there was a somewhat similar service. In 1775, during the Second Continental Congress, a meeting of delegates from the 13 colonies in America, which united in the American Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin was appointed the first Postmaster General. Benjamin had a history in post. He started as the postmaster of Philadelphia. Benjamin's work as postman was to improve the postal system by making deliveries quicker and more efficient. He is seen as the man that made the United States Post Service as it is today. The USPS is an independent agency of the executive branch of the United States government. They are the ones responsible for the postal service in the whole United States. Nowadays, mail isn't used that much, mostly due to the popularity of the email. The post services now mainly focus on package deliveries from the things you ordered online. But I guess you can already imagine that back then it was a great deal for the people. It was something revolutionary, just like the invention of the email.
The 17th century. The 17th century could be characterized by the questioning attitude, with philosophers such as René Descartes, Francis Bacon, and Thomas Hobbes publishing works in which they are skeptical and rational, while also opposing political, scientific, and theological problems. The English Civil War and other religious or political conflicts were a big part of the 17th century. This period of time was reflected through literary development, because countries like Italy and Spain, but also France, had established a form of art and literature called Baroque. Baroque was identified by the expression of feelings and the impetuosity. Baroque could be seen in architecture, literature, as well as the art of painting. Baroque was the product of Italian and German characteristics, so was metaphysical poetry the product of the English characteristics. John Dryden was one of the first writers to speak of the style of poetry called metaphysical poetry, so you could say he was ahead of his time. Metaphysical poetry was intellectualized poetry, marked by conceits, thoughts, and sometimes even paradoxes. Now imagine you live in this world where some people are questioning society and science, basically everything you know. Also, there have just been tons of wars, and suddenly there's a new style of art and literature. The 18th century. The 18th century was a significant period of time, with bloody revolutions, scientific and philosophic heights, and overseas conquering. There's a lot to talk about. The death of William and his sister Anne caused the Stuart dynasty to be ended, and made place for the Hanoverians. The restoration of the English Civil War that occurred in the 17th century was culturally seen as a period of transition from the Renaissance to the Age of Enlightenment. The Renaissance and its thinkers focused on self-development. You probably know the expression, seize the day. The Enlightenment thinkers, on the other hand, emphasized on an orderly society, in which reason became more important than emotion and expressing them. Philosophical scene, it was a transition from Erasmus and Copernicus to Hume and Kant, and from Lof der Zotheit to Kritik der reinen Vernunft. Now, if we look at literature in the 18th century, there have been lots of works that were published by famous authors, such as A Tale of a Top by Jonathan Swift, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, Candide et Optimisme by the Frenchman Voltaire. Now, as you may know, there were also two significant revolutions in the 18th century. The independence of the United States of America from the British Empire in 1787, and the French revolutions 2 years after that, which drove out the French king and the aristocracy. Moving on to colonialism and economy, Britain was a force to be reckoned with. With military and political power, as well as the huge amount of colonies that Britain had, Britain became rich. Then steam power appeared and industrialization became much quicker and cheaper. The Industrial Revolution also continued its path into the 19th century. Trading and manufacturing became more important than the agricultural sector, which was the cause of many people moving from the rural areas to the big cities to supply demand for factory work. This move is also known as urbanization.
Which cultural/literary developments occurred in the 18th century? To begin with, there was space for the development of political journalism, the first novels appeared in this period, and newspapers and magazines also started to become a thing in the 18th century. There have been quite a few really good novels in this period, like Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, and Love in Excess. Jonathan Swift was one of the greatest writers in this period. He did not only write poems, but also the book Gulliver Travels and books like A Modest Proposal, which is about solving the problems of poor countries by letting them sell their kids as foods for rich people. An important fact about Swift was that he tried to write realistic in his works. People needed to believe what he wrote. In the 18th century, the concept of parties and politics became more common in English society. The power of the people really became a thing. Another remarkable thing in this period is that religion started to reduce. This is related to the fact that people started to think more by themselves, except for saying, "I don't know how thunder works, so it needs to be God," for example. They now tried to search for answers on things they couldn't explain. Religion didn't really disappear or something, but it just wasn't as important as it was before anymore. Further, there became a possibility to divorce from your partner in the 17th century. In the 18th century, it actually happened moderately. This is related again to the fact that religion started to reduce. In the past, it would have been such a sin to divorce because that was not what God wanted. Another really important thing that had much development in its period was science. There have been so many events in the scientific field. One really important part was the locomotive. People were now able to travel long distances in a small time. But there have been so many more inventions in this period. Another really important one was the spinning jenny, for spinning wool or cotton. But this is not even close to all inventions that happened. Think of dynamite, the photograph, the typewriter, the electric generator, and the modern factory. Of course, not all of the inventions were positive. For example, the use of dynamite was thought for mining, but already after a short time people used it as a weapon. You could think of more examples like this by yourself. However, science in this period was not limited to only inventions. There have also been quite a lot advancements of medicine, mathematics, physics, and technology. Most of these advancements happened by really great scientists like Benjamin Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, and James Watt. James Watt was probably the most known scientist of the time by inventing the unit watt and the light bulb. So there have been pretty much developments and great writers/scientists in this period.
In conclusion, we saw that in the 18th century there were a lot of changes and developments. Many of these developments were in science, one of the characteristics of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment gave room for new inventions and new ideas, and with the development in mass communication such as the newspaper and the mail, were these ideas capable of spreading. The mindset wasn't longer in religion, but life itself. These new ideas of the Enlightenment spread faster through the newspaper and the mail. So in the end, mass communication did influence the cultural development of the 18th century.
Thanks for listening.
Ja, zijn we